Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Ukraine Q&A. My name is Ioana, and this is Gloria and Gabe up here with me. We're all history majors and officers for the History Club, and we will be moderating the panel this evening. We are excited to be joined by an expert panel in person to answer questions about the current situation in Ukraine. We also have 3 individuals joining us via Zoom who will be able to share their expertise on the region and offer insights as to how we can take action to help the situation, particularly the mounting refugee crisis as a result of Russia's invasion on Ukraine on February 24th. Allow me to introduce our panel. We have Dr. Charles Bukowski and Dr. Charles Danelle, who are professors in the Department of Political Science and International Studies. Dr. Bukowski teaches courses focusing on the role of intelligence in world affairs, international negotiations and diplomacy, Latin America and Eastern Europe. Dr. Danelle teaches courses on international relations, comparative politics, and the political economy. Angela Weck is in the history department, who focuses primarily on Russian and Eastern European history. She is also executive director of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council. Huang has worked as an independent analyst and specialist in Baltic affairs for the past 20 years. He previously was a correspondent and analyst with Radio Free Europe and as a Baltic editor for the Central European Review. He also worked as the director of public relations with the Joint Baltic American National Committee, a grassroots advocacy organization based in the DC area.
Our guests joining us by Zoom tonight are Marta Farron, Conrad Novak, and Rima Zuraitis. Sorry if I got any of those wrong. Marta Farron is president of the Kiev Mohila Foundation of America and vice president of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Conrad C. Novak is co-chair of the Warsaw Committee, Chicago Sister Cities International, former chair, Polish American Association, and U.S. Army veteran. Rima Zuraitis is chairperson for Blue Yellow Lithuania, a U.S.-based organization supporting Ukrainian efforts for independence and sovereignty since the first Russian invasions in 2014. Thank you all for coming. We are going to start tonight with a few questions for our panel of speakers. We invite you in the audience to begin forming questions about this complicated situation, and questions will be directed at one of the panelists, but any of the panelists may answer and choose to offer additional information, keeping in mind we have only 1 hour to try and make sense of all this. Ioana and Gloria are in the aisles with microphones, or will be, and you will be invited to ask your question in a couple of minutes, as we do have a few that we would like to ask first. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and please remember to ask a question, however, and not make a long statement. We want to get as many questions as possible, so let's get started.
Okay, so we're going to kick it off with a question for each panelist first. So our first question is for Professor Weck. Why do you think students and the community must understand the actual facts of Ukraine history, since Vladimir Putin has offered his own version of the historic relations between Russia and Ukraine that was quite different?
So first, I would like to invite you to pick up a sheet on your way out if you didn't get one on your way in. It gives you a very short history of Ukraine. For most of us who teach Russian history, there is a dilemma that it is Russian history because it is the history of the empire, the history of the Soviet Union, and the history of the Russian Federation today. When it's really important to understand that Ukraine has a much longer history than Putin gave it credit for when he rewrote history with his whole essay right before the start of the war, that Ukraine is really part of Russia and should rejoin Russia, when in fact, it has its own rich history of independence and fighting for independence, that this is not new, this separation between Ukraine and Russia. And it's important for us to remember that Ukraine is in fact a separate sovereign state and go from there.
Dr. Bukowski, would you mind addressing why the United States and NATO have not interceded on Ukraine's behalf? NATO went into Afghanistan, Kuwait, Iraq, and even Yugoslavia in the past. Why not Ukraine?
I think I can give you something like, Mel might know the number, 5,000 or 6,000 reasons. They're called nuclear warheads. I don't mean to be flippant, but that is truly the thing that everybody has to keep in mind. Yeah, 62, okay. And then, and keep in mind that Peoria is what, the 130th largest metropolitan area in the United States. So, they've got plenty even for us. That's the major thing. We could play games and think about what would happen if nobody had nuclear weapons, but no one wants a nuclear war. I'll leave it at that.
Our next question is for Dr. Danelle. It seems that Putin feels the history of the Soviet period is more important to the future of Russian state today than any other factor. Do you believe that he wants to resurrect the Soviet Union? And is that what is driving his demands to roll back the so-called Western influence from the former Soviet space?
I think it's less that Putin wants to resurrect the Soviet Union because communism no longer exists. The key issue is whether he wants to come up with some semblance of the old Russian Empire. And since, as Professor Weck was suggesting, when you look historically, the roots of Russia are actually in Kievan Rus. And so Ukraine is a critical part of what was the Russian Empire. And that's one of the driving reasons why Putin wants to bring it back into the fold again. But in terms of the Soviet Union itself, that's a completely different animal.
All right, the next question is for Mr. Huang. With your specialization in the Baltics, would you expand on the idea that Putin wants to roll back the EU and NATO out of the former Soviet space? What would that mean for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia?
Well, first of all, both of the enlargements of NATO and the European Union to the Baltics happened in 2004. At the time, believe it or not, before that, Putin actually voiced statements that did not actively oppose these enlargements. He gave a very interesting interview on NPR in 2001 saying that basically any state has the right to decide on its own security arrangement. Gee, does that, I would love to play that back for him today. However, if you look at the Baltics, there is revanchism, the thought amongst some members of Putin's inner circle. Again, I think I would agree that a lot of it's more of recreating the old Russian Empire, kind of the image of Tsarism. You mix the orthodoxy, you kind of mix all of that together rather than this artificial construct called the Soviet Union. So I think there is that temptation. However, the problem is NATO is a treaty organization that's based on collective defense. And if one country is attacked, it's considered an attack on all. So that is why, for example, Ukraine is viewed at very differently as the Baltics, even from Moscow's point of view, because they realize that is an incredibly different red line to cross if they decide to do that. It would be tantamount to going into Alaska, on basis of international law and treaty obligations. And the EU is a completely different monster in a way. And I think in a way it has not, that's something that is a little different because that's a economic and community issue is less right now, is less of a defensive issue. So definitely the NATO thing was big. And the reason the Baltics are probably safe right now is because they are members of NATO. If you look at Georgia, if you look at Moldova, you look at Ukraine, that's exactly what happens when you don't have Article 5 as your guarantor.
Our next question is for Mr. Novak. So as a US veteran, what do you think about the volunteer efforts of former US military personnel going to Ukraine to help on the battlefield?
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. Lovely to join you this evening under these difficult times. first of all, it's extremely impressive, and I think it's noteworthy to notice that they are not just U.S. Army veterans. I mean, there are veterans from all over the world, either Ukrainians from Ukrainian descent or others that are combat experienced individuals that are filling the Legion, the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, if you will. And, you know, tying that together to, I think, the Ukrainian military in general and how admirably they are performing. Let's not forget that, you know, NATO and US forces have been working for many, many years training the Ukrainian military. And that is one of the major reasons, coupled with the fact that you're seeing a truly catastrophic performance on behalf of the Russian military, and a complete collapse of command and control, logistics, and many other things that I think are pushing the war in a different direction. But the response throughout the world has been incredible of veterans from everywhere. And I think that just stands to show how the world feels about what they're seeing on their screens every night.
Thank you, Mr. Novak. The next question is for Ms. Farron. Your organization has been active in supporting the sovereign state of Ukraine since the collapse of the USSR through political, economic, and cultural channels. What is the Ukrainian emigre community doing to address the current situation in its efforts to lobby the US Congress?
Well, first of all, let me just thank you for including me in this distinguished panel. It's a pleasure to be with you. And it's also a pleasure to be present at a university environment because as of the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, I left my legal practice to become president of an NGO in the United States to assist Ukraine's oldest university that's over 400 years old, because of my complete and total conviction that education is the key to bring about any real change. And we've seen that in the last 25, 30 years. Ukraine now has a new generation of people who believe and want democracy and freedom. I am a member of the Ukrainian diaspora community. I was not born in Ukraine. My parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were born in the city of Lviv in Western Ukraine, just very close to the Polish border. And I was brought up as a, speaking several languages at home. So I do speak Ukrainian. And in these last 30 years, I had an opportunity to travel to Ukraine at least a good 50 times related to matters of reforms in higher education. But since your question is specifically about what the community is doing with members of Congress, we are very actively working with them. And I am very happy to say that both senators of Illinois, Senator Durbin, Senator Duckworth, and also members of Congress, Representatives Quigley, Kasten, Davis, Krishnamurti. We've met with all of them, Representative Shakowski. They are really rooting for bringing about more aid to Ukraine. I think that the choices now in people and the reaction of the general public in support of Ukraine is kind of biblical proportions, because you clearly see good and evil when people see bombing, intentional bombing of maternity wards and residential areas and children. They realize that this is not just a military war. So working with the members of Congress is very important for us. We also have been in touch with the Security Council and the White House and working very closely with the administration of President Biden. Obviously, now that we see that Russia really is losing on the ground, which is incredible, and I'm very proud of the Ukrainian armed forces and very thankful to the US training of the armed forces that has been going on for a long time. But now that we see that, we still realize that Ukraine needs a lot of help, especially to bring down those missiles. So those types of weapons are extremely needed. And we lobby for that. I don't want to use the word lobbying. We're not registered lobbyists, but we certainly advocate for more help for Ukraine. And we are very helpful to the US government for all the help that it's been giving. And we're also very helpful to the government and the people of Poland and the other countries that have been admitting refugees from Ukraine.
Our last question before we open it up to the audience is for Ms. Zuraitis. Your organization, Blue Yellow Lithuania, has been active in supporting Ukraine since 2014. Other than the obvious violation of international law, what drives your Lithuanian community to stand with the people of Ukraine?
Well, obviously the people of Lithuania feel very strongly, to help out the Ukrainian people. And I think the thing for us, and just a little bit of background about myself, and I'm sorry I'm in my car, but I'm also a Rotarian and we're doing a very large humanitarian drop over the next few days, and I'm picking that up as well. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
yes.
Good. So, and I'm double booked, but I really wanted to do this for Angela, so it's fine. We'll do this from the car, it's all good. So in addition to Blue Yellow, I've been an active member of the Lithuanian community for many years. I'm also a member of the Baltic American Freedom League, and I work with the Joint National Baltic Committee in Washington. So in terms of Blue Yellow was started by Jonas Oman in Lithuania in 2014 during the first invasion. And then I joined at that point, and we started the US arm here in Chicago a couple of years ago because, at that point, the invasion wasn't very well covered by the news. It was there for a little bit, but not so much. And, Jonas really wanted to keep working, and because this fighting was still going on in Luhansk and Donbass. So obviously now there's so much more going on, and Blue Yellow is recognized by the Lithuanian government. It's backed by the Lithuanian government in terms of that it's a safe organization to donate to. And on our end, because we're in the US, we have a PayPal to donate to because it's a lot harder to donate to a European bank from here. And PayPal doesn't work that way for that. So we have our nonprofit arm here that's federally registered in Illinois. So I think to answer your question, Lithuanians, they feel that it's very important that Ukraine maintains its national sovereignty. I mean, obviously being unfortunately occupied by the Soviet Union for all those years, it leaves the memory of it behind for a lot of people. And, I can also say that even for my own grandmother, who's a displaced person refugee from World War II, she's having flashbacks and nightmares. And I'm sure that that's kind of what's it's awakening that trauma within Lithuanians. And I think for them, the support is extremely important. So obviously Lithuania is taking in many thousands of refugees every day. They're registering the children in schools and things like that, and also sending aid to Ukraine at the same time. So I think that's where that's going to continue, because we really, as Lithuanians, strongly feel that Ukraine is entitled to its national sovereignty.
Thank you. We're now going to be opening up the floor to questions from the public. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and Gloria and I are going to come around with the microphones.
This is for the entire panel. Given Putin's display of tyrannical imperialism, do you think that will spark an imperialistic movement globally? If so, are there any implications because of that?
don't want to touch that one.
Somebody else start.
I think the issue here is going to be what happens with China. Okay. Beyond that, potentially Iran, but Iran has been a longstanding problem in the Persian Gulf. But if you're talking about simply looking at expansionism on the part of the great power, it's going to be what happens with Taiwan. And part of the US reaction to what is going on in Ukraine dovetails into that and sends a message to the PRC of what they can expect if they were to engage in similar actions. Beyond that, some kind of broad-based imperial league or movement, I don't see that. But I think there is a more sort of intermediate term problem, specifically dealing with Asia.
I'm not sure I agree with Iran being imperial, but I think Saudi Arabia might be one to watch. Or maybe the competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran might be something to watch. I also don't think it's going to spark a worldwide imperialistic move. But I agree that we need to be, I think China, would you think China is disappointed in Russia for having jumped the gun? I think there were a lot of folks in Washington, D.C. who were paying closer attention to China's possible attempt to invade or take over Taiwan. And then Russia did it for Ukraine. And so it kind of blew China's plans out of the water. And it's not going well for Russia. And so now China has to regroup. But that is something to pay attention to. Rather than imperialism, however, I think what the world needs to pay attention to is authoritarianism, and in all of its forms, whether it expands across borders or whether it appeals to strong men everywhere to take over their countries, because that's the easier way to do things if they can just make their country do it. There are plenty of people in Russia who are opposed to this war, and they are going to jail by the thousands. So, or leaving the country. Is that what has to happen to bring about change? Is that thousands of people have to go to jail? You know, we live in a free society, and we try to guard against that growth of authoritarianism here. So, and we're in the most free society in the world. So if we struggle with it, imagine where you live in a society that's not very free, and how easy it is for strong men to exert their strength and just get rid of their opposition. And that's what Putin's trying to do with controlling the media, with you know, throwing people in jail who broadcast so-called fake news, which is the actual news about what's really going on. There are reports of the deserters being shot by Russians, their commanders, because these are boys predominantly. They're 18 and 19-year-old boys who are being sent to Ukraine. They're like you know, so can you imagine if tomorrow your government sent you somewhere to fight a war you didn't even understand anything about it, against people who look and talk just like you do? So those are the challenges that Putin is creating for himself, that the world has to pay attention to. And you guys at home, if you want to jump in, please do. Mel?
Yeah, I just want to add a little more to this. One of the more sobering stats about a lot of the Russian troops, including casualties, is that they are not ethnic Russians. That's one thing that a lot of people have not noticed in the media, because in English, Russian is Russian. In Russian, Ruski and Rossiyski are very different concepts. And one is about a nationality. One is about a nationality, and one is about a state, a citizenship of a state. So they're very different things, but they're translated as Russian. If you look at a lot of the casualties, they are from various Islamic minorities, Buddhist minorities, and so forth. And it's actually quite a shocking number if you look at where the geographic distribution of Russian troops, especially professional troops and casualties, are rooted. So that's one of the things to look at, because you talk about empires and growth and so forth. The possibility is also for an implosion and having nationalism become an issue. So these are kind of the other degrees to look at when you look at kind of what the future holds.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to add that most people don't realize exactly that concept, that there's Russia and Ruski citizens, and that the Russian Federation, even now, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, is made up of various nationalities and various provinces or even countries. And they're not happy about what is going on at the center in Moscow. And this is one of the problems that is faced by Putin as well. Plus the fact that in Siberia and on the border with China, there is a lot of just illegal migration of Chinese into Russian territory. There are actually millions of Chinese that crossed the border and are there on Russian territory. And all of these things are what's happening outside of Moscow. Moscow is controlled by Putin, but there is so much more to it than Moscow.
There's a question in the chat about the willingness of the United States and other places around Europe to accept refugees from Ukraine, whereas we're less willing to accept refugees that come from other war-torn parts of the world. And for example, in the last few years, Syria and Iraq. Would anybody like to contemplate an answer to that?
Other than to say yes, I think we'd be in for a really long conversation. We're seeing a good thing happen, and let's sit back and enjoy that part. We can have that conversation a little bit later. It's one that needs to be had, but maybe not now.
May I add to that issue of refugees, because of course this is a hot subject now. We have information that the United States government turned to an NGO, an organization in Washington that obviously is part of the government facilities that implements programs, but it's an organization that implemented the program of Afghan refugees. That was quite a mess, obviously, but the same organization has been approached about implementing the procedures and management of refugees from Ukraine. But I'm not avoiding the question about that Ukrainian refugees are being allowed, although 100,000 is not a lot compared to the 3.5 million that are already left the country. But that is a conversation that needs to be had as well.
The same person typed in the chat a question about Switzerland changing its neutrality status and freezing Russian assets. Does anybody want to contemplate how that has changed the playing field for the oligarchs who stash their dough in Switzerland? Either here or at home? What do you think? Mel?
Well, first of all, the Davos events are a little different now without all the participants from that country. I'm sure the private airport is getting a lot less use. The hotels, they're probably hurting now. So I think in a way it was dramatic. There was a lot of pressure on Switzerland because of that relationship that a lot of, not just oligarchs, even I would say even middle, a lot of middle high class Russians, we kind of talk about where Russians travel to when they can because of where they can go. And if you know people, they're just like, oh, I love Switzerland because that's where I go skiing, and everything like that. So it's something where they aspire to, and having that cut off compared to, let's say, World War II, I think it's a huge psychological hit on them. And unfortunately, too bad that the UAE didn't do the same thing, because that's the other, you know, if you want us to go skiing, you go to Switzerland. If you want to go to the beach and party, you go to Dubai. Unless you're that rich, you can go to the Maldives. So it really was a huge psychological, I think, hit for them, partly because of Davos, of all of these annual events that they've been courted to. If you look at anything from the classical music world to everything else, they've been shut out of Switzerland more and more. And Switzerland has really demonstrated a bending of their, you know, kind of this blanket neutrality. And part of that, I think it's also a part of European integration, because they're also part of EFTA and other non-European Union organizations. They're part of Council of Europe and so forth. So they're not, you know, strictly neutral. They're members of the United Nations, unlike, let's say, the Vatican. You know, you can argue the Vatican's more neutral than them because they're not part of the UN. So I think in a way it is a very important change, because that really cut the Russians off from a lot of what they have to finance the war.
And I want to add just a little footnote to that. For those of you who don't know what Davos is, the World Economic Forum meets in Davos, Switzerland annually. In a nutshell, it's the richest countries and richest individuals in the world who get together to work out ways to stay the richest people and countries in the world. And Russian oligarchs regularly attend.
I'd like to jump in and add to that as well. I think the other thing for Switzerland is that it was, you know, it's 2023 and there's a country invading another country, and most people most countries didn't really think that's something that would happen. So I can see how Switzerland might break away from their neutral position because it's such a shocking event, not to mention the human casualty part of it as well.
That's a good point.
You know, if I may chime in on that as well, this money situation and Switzerland being the banker of the world's criminally gotten funds, it's another conversation, but it is the Western countries that facilitated the money laundering that allowed Putin to hide his money and the oligarchs' money in Western countries. So it'll be very interesting to see what changes are going to come about to the real estate market in Miami and in New York, and in London, when these people are forced to sell. But we'll see what's going to happen about that. But you know, when we talk about sanctimoniously about what is right and wrong, I think that Western countries need to look at themselves as facilitators as well.
That's a good point. I think the next question in the chat might be for Conrad. Bob asks about the accuracy of the supersonic missiles. What if one fired from Russia lands in Poland in error, but nonetheless crosses into NATO territory? What would be the expected result of that? Or anybody else on the panel?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for everybody to know that obviously there is a great deal of preparedness and surveillance that's being undertaken by NATO, driven primarily by the United States. Our surveillance systems are literally flying up and down the border there. Some have heard about the Global Hawk, to the point that literally within seconds of any type of launch, our forces already know something's in the air and can track it. Very recently, the United States deployed 2 batteries of Patriot missile defense systems to Poland. And in addition to that, the Poles obviously have some of their own defenses. As far as a mistake goes, and if something would go wrong, I am absolutely certain that there is a contingency and expectation plan that a response would be withheld pending a review of what the intent was, or whether in fact it was an accident. And I mean, to carry on some of the earlier comments and seeing how the administration generally has been very cautious with active engagement in Ukraine with US forces, I would probably guess that it would not warrant an immediate response if it was an accidental. Now, having said that, that depends what kind of accident, right? That depends. If you're talking something landing in the middle of Warsaw, that is a horse of a different color. I don't imagine anything like that would happen.
Anybody else want to chime in on a potential error or other?
I have a question, actually. As was just mentioned, NATO is watching very carefully and vigilantly, but we have, as far as I know, pretty extensive ability to speak with the Russian army, right? I've not heard or seen anything about how much of that communication is going on now, but there've always been channels of communication that were designed during the era of détente, this is going way back, to deal with just kind of this very thing, and oops. And so I'd be curious to know, how much are we, are we talking with the Russian army right now, or are all of the channels open?
Well, I can comment on that because I do know the answer as of recently, and not to incite any fear, but that communication that we historically have had, and at the initiation of the conflict did have, directly bypassing political channels and all of that between the Pentagon and the Russian Defense Ministry, has been basically shut down for approximately the past 2 weeks or so, which does raise the point of an unintentional error, a miscalculation. And I do think that plays into, and I think some others on the panel can comment on the mindset of Putin and how he benefits from panic or people not knowing what his next move is. I think that strategy is more designed to bring that type of thinking into bear. But sadly, we do not have, unless something changes, last I checked yesterday with some individuals that I know, we don't have those channels right now, which is kind of concerning.
Just let me add something really quick. We're talking about an accident with a missile, and believe it or not, there was one last week when an Indian missile went over and landed in Pakistan. It was a nuclear capable missile, but it wasn't. It was unarmed. However, that just gives you an example of how these things can happen. And luckily, I think the responses on both sides were surprisingly responsible. So, but that's not, if you look at the tensions, at the Polish border, I mean, God forbid.
And we have a question here.
Hi, so this might be aimed a little bit more towards Professor Danelle and Professor Bukowski. I'm sorry. It comes from their classes. Specifically, so given the current state of the international system, specifically with international institutions, do you think that there's a way for the United States to effectively engage with Russia through these institutions, or do you think they'll have to kind of go beyond the more traditional liberal scope of things?
I'm sure there's a lot going on that we're not hearing about. I don't know what all those channels might be and who might be doing the talking, but certainly trying to get out of Russia, what will it take to put an end to this? Can we set this up so that you can declare victory and leave? Because the longer this goes on, the more chances for the oops that we just been talking about. Every single day, you create many more opportunities for this to happen. So, I'm sure there's things going on. It may not be directly, maybe through intermediaries as well. But I would think things are happening. But we're so focused on the day-to-day battlefront news that we're not hearing much about that. And maybe that's the idea too. We don't want whatever's being talked about to get out just now, so that the parties can work something out, or at least can communicate to each other what they're looking for, and then there can be some. There's also some what we call in my business tacit bargaining, where there's no direct communication, but where messages are sent or assumed to be sent through some sort of a gesture, things like that. But not heard a lot about that yet, but I'm certain it's going on.
Well, if I can add, just yesterday there was a summit meeting in Turkey where both parties got together, and it was the Russian side that was proposing peace talks and willing to withdraw troops around the area of Kyiv and north of Kyiv and around Kyiv. And it just seems very odd, because you don't ask for peace negotiations when you're winning. So shall we believe that really Putin wants to pull back and sign an agreement about neutrality or about a security agreement? Shall we trust any signature on any agreement that he signs? I mean, certainly history does not support that type of faith in his word, but it looks like he realizes that he is not winning the way he wanted to, that his aim was to take over Ukraine in 3 to 5 days and take over the government, and that has not happened. So there's a lot of pushback at home. People are commenting, people are very disappointed. They're confused in Russia. So maybe he is aiming at a different outcome by taking over Mariupol and the area in the east, and then declaring victory at home. But of course, that's not going to keep him satisfied for too many years.
We have another question back here.
What do you think about the prospect of Putin being overtaken in a coup?
I think the situation would have to become much more grave before that happened. I mean, it's obviously a concern for him, because the only time I've seen him in close proximity to anyone was with Aeroflot flight attendants. Right. Other than that, the people within his inner circle, they don't get within 30 feet of him. So he's obviously concerned about something like that happening. But the reality is his security is very, very good. And the possibility that he would be subject to that, unless there was an even further deterioration in the Russian fortunes, I think is problematic. But I want to come back to some comments that were just made. You really have to take the Russian gesture of reducing pressure on Kyiv with a grain of salt. It's entirely possible that they're repositioning their forces in order to basically take the Donbass. And then once they've secured that, wait a while, come back, take some more. In other words, a salami tactic over time. And so I don't think I would put a great deal of trust into what Putin is doing. The other part of this coming from the negotiations that have been taking place in Turkey. This, I think, is important because it shows Erdogan is offering his good offices as an intermediary between the two sides. because simply letting the US try to negotiate, we're tainted, and that's not going to work. But one of the things the Ukrainians have been insisting on is security guarantees. And those security guarantees coming from the major partners, i.e. NATO, is tantamount to a backdoor NATO membership. And that's something that the United States and the NATO allies are going to have to seriously consider if they're willing to go that far in securing some kind of a peace arrangement between Ukraine and Russia. But back specifically to your question, I would not be eager, or I would not be anticipating any kind of change in Putin's position anytime soon.
I'd like to add to that because there's been a couple of defections. So Anatoly Chubais fled to Turkey. He is one of Putin's inner circles and helped him become prime minister way back in 1999 when he was interim president. And he has left the country. There's another one who left whose name escapes me at the moment. But a coup would imply that somebody else has enough power to secure enough support to take over. And at the moment, the inner circle of Putin's friends and allies includes the top leaders of the military, the top leaders of heavy industry, the media. Unless it's from his inner circle, which would be, coup d'etat, that's not likely to happen though. So, and that leads to one of the questions that was in the chat as well. Who would take over? Officially, it would be the prime minister. Can anybody name the prime minister of Russia today? Because Putin replaced him with an absolute nobody who's an accountant. And so officially, the person who should take over will not take over. Will it be the military, Shoigu? I can tell you who that is because he's often next to Putin, but he has not been seen with Putin lately. That doesn't mean that he's not, that he's plotting against Putin. It just means that Putin is nervous. So.
Yeah, I would.
Oh, go ahead.
I would add a strong agreement that I think it's unlikely, given the current state of affairs, that we will see a departure of Vladimir Putin. I mean, he has prepared for that possible eventuality literally for decades through a division of the various state security groups and breaking them up so there is not one centralized one, so they cannot communicate. Coupled with the fact that at the end of the day, I think it's also important to realize while there are thousands of people that are risking their own freedom and being thrown in jail because of this grasp on media that he has, it's sometimes difficult for us as Americans to even consider that. Even with the criticisms we may have of our own media right now, you really have no idea what it's like to be in Russia. And I would hazard a guess that still over 50% of people there will support him. They support the strength that he projects. So I always, being also a student of Sino-Soviet history, to me, it always comes from the streets, so to speak, right? That's how it's happened. And until we see the masses really rise, I don't think there's anybody in a position to take that spot, as some of the speakers have eloquently stated. Or to quote the Who song, say hello to the new boss. He's the same as the old boss. So it would likely be somebody like that.
We have another question right here.
Hello. History has shown that invading countries never stop with the one country they say that they want. So how can the US stop Russia from just targeting non-NATO, non-nuclear countries without bringing on the onslaught of nuclear war behind it? For example, is Finland in trouble? Is Kazakhstan in trouble? Georgia? How can we stop this expansion without bringing on potential nuclear war?
I think the simple answer to that is if U.S. vital interest is at stake, we stop it. If U.S. vital interest isn't at stake, we don't stop it. So ultimately, it depends upon the interest of the United States, not the interest of the country that's being attacked. Okay? Now, Finland is now seriously rethinking whether it wants to be part of NATO or not, given what has happened in its neighborhood. But also, when you look at what Russia has done, they're interested in the neighboring regions, not any kind of far-flung projection. And so you're right. Georgia should be nervous because, well, you can argue Georgia provoked the attack earlier, but ultimately it's not for the United States to protect them unless our interests are at stake in protecting them. Okay, that's it.
So I have a question. Is there an interest of the United States to protect Ukraine, and how much of an interest does it have?
Yes, there is an interest in protecting Ukraine because Ukraine borders on NATO, and we have to defend the eastern flank of NATO from any kind of attack. And so by providing assistance to Ukraine, short of the use of our own manpower, we reinforce the eastern flank of NATO.
And Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, the third largest country in the world to have nuclear power, in 1994 under the Budapest Memorandum. And frankly, the other parties to the agreement, Russia, the United States, and Britain, did not come to its aid as agreed in that particular agreement. At least that's what happened in the previous two invasions. So this time, I think that the United States has taken a much stronger position.
It's true, because with the Budapest Agreement and also the preceding Lisbon Protocol, we made security guarantees to Ukraine for them to give up their weapons. And we didn't follow through on those security provisions. We also did the same with South Vietnam. So sovereign powers can walk away from agreements if they don't find it to be in their interest. That's the reality of international relations.
We have another question over here.
So everyone from McDonald's to Facebook has pulled out of Russia. Switzerland has frozen their assets. How long after the war until everybody's back in and we're all buddy-buddy again?
I think we got to get to the end of the war first.
That's all I was going to say is let's get to the end of the war and see what things look like after this is over.
I think there's going to be real potential, assuming that Ukraine emerges from this intact, to rebuild Ukraine. So that's, I think, where some possibility for some serious investment. The caterpillars of the world who have the earth moving equipment to rebuild all the roads and bridges and buildings that have been blown up. In Ukraine, assuming that Ukraine survives it, is probably where people will move. But I don't know. But how long is the war going to last? Marge had a question about the chemical weapons. Is there a red line to the use of chemical weapons? We've seen in the last couple of months that when Russia begins to accuse the United States or Ukraine of some action, it's really a forewarning for the action that they are going to take against Ukraine. What do you think about chemical weapons?
I'm not going to say very much about that because all of this speculation that has been going on for the last 6 weeks, and very often I think we're speculating on decisions that the Russians haven't even made yet. I like to think that Putin hasn't made that decision yet. So when the CIA is trying to provide background knowledge on, when President Biden is saying, what's going to happen, guys? They're being asked to answer a question that hasn't been decided yet. I'm sorry to distract on that. I don't know how it plays out if they use chemical weapons, or if they use it just once versus 2 or 3 or 4 times. I really don't know. And it's going to depend too, not only, because we keep saying, how's the US going to react? You know, remember, you've got a bunch of other states in NATO right now, and they're on board. And it's really important to keep this coalition together. It came together far more quickly and with far more unity than I don't think than anyone really anticipated. We've heard a lot about how we didn't anticipate how badly things would go for the Russians. We didn't anticipate how well the Ukrainians would do. Well, we also didn't anticipate how well the rest of Europe has moved in shoulder to shoulder. And whoever asked the question about the Swiss, no, you're exactly right. Who would have thought that a month ago? And the, you know, and all these companies pulling out. Charles, did you see this yesterday that the French energy company Total announced they're pulling out of Russia, and their investment is billions. Yeah, not single digit billions, but I think double digit billions. All right.
Angela, I just wanted to jump in here really quick because I do have to unfortunately leave. Here's my hot take on chemical warfare. It has been verified that some of the Russian soldiers are carrying around chemical warfare antidotes with them. That has been found on their persons. So I wouldn't put anything past Putin at this point. The comment about not trusting anything that comes from him is spot on. I just wanted to say as a parting word, I am also a historian. I studied history in my undergraduate degrees, but I would recommend to all of you to watch The Soviet Story if you want an idea of Putin's mindset, because he closes that film with a quote saying that the greatest single geopolitical tragedy of this century was the fall of the Soviet Union. So I leave you with that. Do your research.
Wait, Rima.
If anybody, go ahead.
Yeah, Rima, don't leave, because I wanted to ask a question about Belarus.
Okay.
And if Belarus
go for it.
engaged, yeah, if Belarus becomes engaged more fully, right now they're just hosting Russian forces, you know, as a launching place for Russian forces to go into Ukraine. What if Belarus becomes more of an active player? What does that mean for the Baltic states?
Well, see, now we have a problem, and there's actually two different problems here. It's not just Belarus. If Putin comes through Poland, the Suwalki Gap is now compromised, which is another way into the Baltics. If Belarus becomes more active within, like under, you know, Putin, because we know that Lukashenko is one of his puppets, that also presents a very large problem for Baltic security. And yes, we do have NATO, but even if we already know that Putin has used one of these excuses as the NATO expansion for why he started the war, you know, in Ukraine. That's one of the things he said, other than the ridiculous notion of denazification. It could mean a lot of security issues for the Baltics. Absolutely, there's a high chance of risk if Belarus becomes more active. The one thing that I have noticed, however, is that there are protesters in Belarus. I don't know if anybody saw, but this past few days, Belarusians at the railroads blew up the railroad tracks so that Putin couldn't use it to funnel in more of his war stuff. So that is a little small glimmer of hope. What Lukashenko will do, I don't know.
Thank you, Rima. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Angela, for inviting me. Please, please, please watch The Soviet Story by Edwin Schnorr. It's on Amazon. And if you have any questions about Blue Yellow, Angela has my contact information. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, Rima.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mel, did you want to add anything about the potential for the Baltics?
Well, sorry. Well, I think again, it's
closer.
Once we're talking about going past the NATO, you know, into NATO territory, that is a significantly different decision from Moscow, because that really means the difference. For example, when we're talking about Budapest in '94, how, you know, implicit security arrangements for Ukraine, that fell apart. However, when it comes to NATO, these are treaty obligations. This is about as high up in international relations as it gets. You really, once you start violating treaties, especially if you kind of you know, say, hey, well, you know what, I'm sorry you declared Article 5, but we're not interested. That would pretty much be the end of the global order, honestly, because that's the basis of Europe's security since World War II has been revolving around NATO and how NATO has provided that Article 5 guarantee. And whether you talk about the Suwałki Gap, you want to talk about the Kodiak Islands, you know, anything like that, anything within the North Atlantic space is part of this collective security. You attack one, you attack everyone. So I think in a way that it's sad that Ukraine is on the other side of that red line when it comes to, let's say, Washington or even Berlin, you know, the most reluctant of capitals when it comes to these things. But once you cross that red line into NATO territory, that becomes tantamount to an attack on your own country. So I think if that does happen, I mean, we are talking about World War III. You know, you know, there's no other way to put it.
I have another question from the chat that I'd like to throw out and see if there's any response. If Putin loses Ukraine, does that signal the end of his presidency, number one? And how is it more likely that his conviction as a war criminal will come to fruition if he is ousted from power? Or is there any possibility that he's going to be held accountable for this at all?
Number one, define lose Ukraine.
If Ukraine succeeds in either repelling the Russian forces or succeeds in not losing any territory to Russia.
I think what Putin would do would be to somehow declare victory and go home. Most likely he's in a position where he could take the Donbass one way or another and claim the territorial victory. The Ukrainians have said that they're amenable to neutrality and not joining NATO, which has been one of his key concerns, so he can declare victory there. That lessens the pressure on him domestically, and he would likely survive. I think the interesting question, would he be prosecuted, let alone convicted of war crimes? Well, they're not members of the ICC, just as the United States are not members of the ICC. So they're not subject to that. And I seriously doubt the Russians would turn him over any more than we would turn over a US president to do that. So I don't think that's a serious issue going forward.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? The next question was pretty interesting as well. Putin's control of social media. I think the question is social media a factor in the war? Because many on social media have been labeled as extremist. If you speak out against Putin, you have to very explicitly identify yourself as a foreign agent, even though you are completely Russian, lived in your entire life in Russia, you're a Russian, but if you voice any objections to Putin, you have to identify yourself as a foreign agent. So he controls virtually all forms of media in Russia. Can he use that to sell his victory? Whatever his victory might be, what do you think? Mal, you're a marketing guru.
Well, I am with Bradley's Office of Marketing Communication, so I guess this is kind of my area. Well, you look at some of the assets that he has. If you look at, for example, there's this thing called RUtube, or is that how you pronounce it? RUtube? Their version of YouTube is RUtube, and it's full of propaganda video. They have their own social media. You know, Telegraph has been very important for them. A lot of the ones that we use all over the world, they are disconnected. They are banned as for extremist material. A lot of Russians use VPN. They're still trying to maintain accounts. There are influencers on TikTok and Instagram that are, you know, fighting to keep their profiles going. So there is a lot of controls, but The Russians have played, they've played this game before to try to get through censors, much like how the Chinese, public are trying to get over the virtual, the virtual Great Wall, I forget what the name of it is. But so there is definitely that. However, if you look at social media in general, part of this being cut off also has meant that the Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian interests have completely won the battle on social media. From day one, whether it is footage of tractors pulling tanks, Russian tanks away, whether it is a young Ukrainian influencer teaching people how to drive a tank that you've stolen from the Russians, they've won this. They've won that part of the war. That's part of how I think the Ukrainian interests have really got, let's say, Hollywood got young people behind. I did a long loop around central Illinois last weekend, and I actually saw more Ukrainian flags and signs than Trump signs in rural Illinois. And I think that says a lot of how social media, not just traditional media, but also social media, because a lot of people who you won't expect have changed their icons and their avatars or added a blue and yellow something to their social media account. So Ukraine has won that war, and the Russian, whenever they do it, they post something, they look completely unhinged at the moment. If you read some of the Russian embassy tweets, you're thinking, my goodness, really have to hit the vodka this early. It's actually quite shocking, some of it. But as someone who also monitors Russian media, that doesn't surprise me, because you have leadership in the parliament saying that, hey, to try to convince the Americans we are serious, let's launch an ICBM into the Nevada desert and nuke them. Nuke the US, nuke Nevada, because that would show we're serious. And this is the equivalent of Nancy Pelosi saying this. So it just shows how far the rhetoric has gone on that side. And when they're broadcasting this on social media, they look beyond unhinged, I think, for the rest of the world. But I think that is a war that Ukraine has already won. Just tractors. Seriously, just the tractors, I think they've won that.
If I may add about media in Russia, I know it's very difficult for Americans to even imagine anything like this, but in Russian television, they are actually saying things like, we need to defend Russia because the the United States is at the border ready to attack us, and they are throwing missiles. I mean, they say the most outrageous things to their people, but if the population does not have access to other information, after a while, people start believing it. So the United States is also portrayed as a real enemy trying to invade Russia.
And I had a different take on the role of social media. And that is, and perhaps you've seen some stories about this, where you have the Russians invading in certain parts of Ukraine and coming in, and Ukrainians are standing there with their phones taking pictures. And it allows the Ukrainian armed forces, basically it's like having scouts, real-time scouts, telling them where exactly these tanks are, how many of them are there, and maybe a closer examination of the video can tell you some things about the status. That's something that the folks like at the U.S. Army War College are going to be talking about in their courses, I think, over the next decade or so.
There's also a number of reports, and Mel and I talked about this a few days ago. Russia had a very well-developed encryption system for their military communications, but it relied upon the use of the cell towers. They blew up all the cell towers, And so they couldn't use their military encryption system to talk to each other. And instead they were using regular cell service, which allowed the Ukrainian forces to, tap into their, and hear their messages and be able to understand where they were going to be and, foible their plans. So there's a lot of levels to this, but the important thing to remember is that Russia still has a whole lot of bombs, and it's increasingly like Putin is thinking about using them. Somebody asked about the pain of the sanctions. Have sanctions had any impact?
Well, the effect of the sanctions develops over time. And so you're going to have some immediate impact of the sanctions, particularly the financial transactions that are now being blocked. But the real pain develops over time, and it's going to especially take the effect of not having access to semiconductors, not being able to get the materials that you need in order to build your military. So sanctions are never designed to be an immediate response. They're something that just attrits over time. And that's something that you simply have to be patient with. And Americans aren't particularly patient when it comes to those kind of things, but that's the effect of the sanctions.
The other choice is American boots on the ground. So, do you want to see if sanctions can have a lasting impact, or do you want to, jump in right away and put forces there? And I don't think any of us were anxious to put U.S. forces in Ukraine. So, how effective is Radio Free Europe? I think that's a question for Mel, but.
My former employer. Well, the thing is, at the after the Cold War, obviously the mission changed, and as a lot of the one thing about Radio Free and all of U.S. broadcasting is that they broadcast in the languages of the locals. So for Russian service, it's in Russian. In Bashkir, in Bashkiristan, in Chechnya, they'll do it in Chechen and so forth. So that's very much part of what U.S. foreign broadcasting does, whether it's VOA or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. A lot of that is being blocked. Obviously, any type of signals are compromised. The websites are very hard to access. There are still working journalists who are being harassed on a daily basis, for which you're probably not surprised. But the access to them is challenging. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of Russians use VPN, so they have, they're trying to play this dodgeball type of game in trying to get news access. However, it is extremely difficult, partly also by having their social media, their Western social media cut off. That, like their Twitter, that actually has made it more difficult for them to get information as well. So the broadcasts are still happening, whether it's video or anything else. Some of it is being spread through Telegram, which is one of their big communications things. Of contacted, that don't even bother. That is completely controlled. But Telegram is something that there's a lot of communication still going on. So the radios are trying their best. And the other thing too is they're also trying to affect the conversation to Russian speakers that are not in Russia. So that's another key part of what the Russian service for Radio Liberty and Voice of America does. For example, the Russian-speaking population in the Baltic states, the Russian-speaking population in Finland, the Russian-speaking population in Moldova, etc. So these are also aspects of the broadcasting that perhaps have secondary targets that are important as well.
We have come to the end of our time. Marta or Conrad, do you guys have any last comments you'd like us to know? Anything we haven't covered that you think we should know?
This was a wonderful, very informative roundtable discussion. I really appreciate it. I think that more of these discussions should take place. And I hope we can have another one when the war finishes and we come to the end to summarize what happened.
And from my perspective, although most of my comments seem to be focused on military items this evening, is to make it absolutely clear how much Poland, the Polish community here in the United States and throughout the world has really risen to open their arms to Ukraine and do everything that they can. Marta and I have worked very closely together. 2 days ago, I moderated a conversation between Lori Lightfoot of Chicago and the mayor of Warsaw, who is now hosting 300,000 refugees. So we as a community know very well what it's like when we look back to 1939, what this feels like. And certainly we're glad that the world has joined together in a way that I think we've not seen before. That is something that makes this really unique, how the unity and everybody has coalesced to stand up together. And the sanctions, although historically sanctions do take time, the severity of what they are like now, where Russians, their cards don't work and McDonald's is gone. Everybody's seeing this, and I think we need to do more. But I think we're off to a good start. We can hope for a quick resolution of the war. Thank you all very much for having me this evening. It was wonderful.
And gentlemen, anything you want to add? You're good.
Say good night, Gracie.
Good night, Gracie. Well, on behalf of the Department of History, the Departments of Political Science and International Study, and our good friends over in marketing, thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd like to offer a few pieces of advice. Number one, take foreign languages. It's important for you to understand what's going on in the world, and one of the best ways to do that is to learn another language. You learn about the culture, you learn about the people, you learn about the politics, and it builds an understanding. Bradley offers several. Study abroad. Go someplace and understand what the rest of the world is like. It will give you a great appreciation for what you have here. But it also helps build the global relationships that we need to make this world work. And become a member of the World Affairs Council. There you go. There's my plug for the night. Our friends at the History Club, what have you got? Anything?
First of all, can we get a round of applause for all of our panelists, please? On behalf of History Club, thank you for coming tonight. If you're interested on more information about History Club or any of the other organizations that we've talked about tonight, you can sign up on your way out, or if it's History Club specifically, you can come talk to me or Joanna or Gabe. And that's all that we have. So. And
the papers that you were able to pick up on the way in, or you can pick them up on the way out, have a number of organizations that are good organizations if you're looking for somewhere to donate to. They include organizations that were offered by our guests on Zoom tonight. So you know they're good ones. They personally know the organizations and recommend them. So consider, if you'd like to help refugees, consider making a donation to one of those great organizations. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Conrad.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.